Hi, my name is James. Last month I made a video about ISA-88. If you've not seen it, I suggest you follow the link in the comments below and watch that first. It's called ISA-88 Batch Control Design. Now I imagine that some of you may have watched that and thought, hang on, that's not exactly S88 according to my organisation. And you're probably correct, because the reality isn't as clear-cut as perhaps it should be. So this video is a narrative about the variations on ISA-88 that are in play these days and how they came about. I hope it makes things at least somewhat clearer. Okay, first let's have a look at the original version of ISA-88. The rounded rectangle panels here represent physical groupings. The process cell, units, equipment modules and control modules. There's two main types of functional entity: the procedural control in the blue rectangles and the basic control in the small diamonds at the bottom. Another type, coordination control, is not shown here to avoid clutter, but that's the glue that connects the control to the physical groupings. The procedural control is the bit that causes the transformation of material into product. It always acts on the batch. The bottom level phases requests action from the basic control to affect these transformations. The basic control is all other measurement and equipment control that would be present even when no recipe is being executed. It's the control we see on a P&ID, largely the logic of control modules, valves, motors, regulatory loops and instruments. Notice that control modules can contain other control modules, which allows more complex control sequences and algorithms to be defined. This type of control module is named as a compound control module in ISA-88, and it's central to the following analysis. In short, every functional requirement that you can think of can be defined in this model. So, job done then, you would think. Unfortunately, the interpretations of ISA-88 soon mutated. I refer to the first main variant as the maximum EM variant. I speculate that this happened because in ISA-88 version 1 there was a physical model diagram that could give the impression that units were made up only of equipment modules, and only equipment modules contain control modules. On the contrary, the text of the standard made it clear that units were the main processing equipment, and that equipment modules were completely optional and indeed rare in a unit. But regardless of the root cause, this variant arose. By assuming that units must be built only from equipment modules, the whole intent of ISA-88 was bent out of shape to fit this false restriction. All the phases that should belong to the unit were assigned to non-processing equipment like inlet lines, because they had to go somewhere, right? This model is no doubt familiar in some organisations. Okay, putting that one to the side for the moment. The next main variant that persisted I will call the basic control EM variant. In this variant, the term equipment module was used instead of the term compound control module. This was a straightforward misunderstanding. Actual equipment modules should have been associated with minor batch processing tasks, but instead the term was used for sequencing of valves and pumps, for example. As we can see, this causes a problem because we now have two definitions of an equipment module which are in conflict. This conflict is only present if there are also actual ISA-88 defined equipment modules present, so if none are defined then the conflict is hidden. This was often the case. Notice that the first variant results in all phases being associated with equipment modules, and in this variant results in 0 phases associated with equipment modules. From what I remember, these two ISA-88 variants were actually more widely followed than the actual ISA-88. So it seems that in version 2 of ISA-88 in 2010, there was an attempt to create a sort of unified ISA-88. Okay, so what happened next? Going back to the first variant, the maximum EM variant, this was in my view the most consequential error because following it actually causes more distortion of the design. But it was also the easiest to fix. In version 2 of ISA-88, it was simply made clear that equipment modules were optional, and therefore there was no need to fragment units into pseudo equipment modules. and phases could be properly assigned to units. The misinterpretation of the term equipment module, while probably less consequential, was trickier to include in the new unified ISA-88. Starting from the name conflict, two simple solutions come to mind. Solution 1, send out a memo to all the miscreants to stop calling compound control modules equipment modules. Let's call this the King Canute option. Solution 2, install my preferred option if there's a version 3 of ISA-88. Accept reality and rename compound control modules as equipment modules, and rename the physical entity equipment module as minor unit, which I think suits it better. Well, that's obviously not what happened. Bringing non-compliant approaches into compliance seems to have been the aim, not clarity. So look away now if you're a lover of elegant solutions. Firstly, equipment modules as originally defined were given the prefix recipe aware. And a new entity called a generic equipment module was invented and placed roughly in the same space as the compound control module. In this way, it was possible to continue to use the term equipment module for basic control. So that is where we now stand with ISA-88 version 2 2010. Now you may wonder, what is the difference between this new generic equipment module entity and the compound control module? They do seem to inhabit a similar space. Let's compare. First, the types of control that they can execute. Well, they may both contain elements of basic control and/or coordination control. But unlike a compound control module, a generic equipment module may also include procedural control. Now, that seems to make it a bit like the original equipment module definition. However, on further investigation, it turns out that it doesn't implement the procedural state model. That is, starting, running, completing, aborting, that logic. Here's the quote from ISA-88 that excludes it from implementing the standard states. It's also not initiated by a recipe, and it's not part of the procedural control model. So what that means is that it carries out procedural control, but has none of the characteristics of procedural control. Now, to me that's weird. It doesn't waddle, it doesn't quack, and it doesn't lay eggs, but it is apparently still a duck. So go figure. For me it's simple. It's a thing that allows us to call a compound control module an equipment module and still nominally comply with ISA-88. If you don't want to do it, then you can simply ignore these entities. And then you don't need to add the prefix to the original equipment modules. Hey presto, ISA-88 version 2 resolves to version 1, which is after all the international standard. That's it folks. I hope my little narrative has thrown some light on the variations between my description of ISA-88 and a version that is more familiar to you. I'm James at zavco.com. Please subscribe and like, or I'll make more videos.